Welcome back to France 24. I'm Delon de Susan. We're live from Paris. The headlines at this hour. Agnès Buzyn replaces France's health minister as she throws her hat in the race for Paris mayor. Her late entry coming after Benjamin Griveaux dropped out over a sexting scandal. Lawmakers also in France begin debating planned reforms of the country's pension system. Opposition lawmakers introduce over 40,000 amendments in a bid to delay passing the text. And Mike Pompeo continues his African tour with a stop expected in Ethiopia. The Secretary of State is the first U.S. cabinet official to visit the continent in 18 months. But first, France has a new health minister, Olivier Véran, taking over after Agnès Buzyn was named as a candidate for Paris mayor. Her late entry coming after Benjamin Griveaux dropped out of the race over a sexting scandal. For more on the trio at the heart of Griveaux's fall, here's France 24's Julia Kim reporting.
Alexandre de Tadeo, Piotr Pawlenski and Juan Branco, the trio at the heart of the Griveaux affair. Authorities extended the weekend detention of the Russian artist and his girlfriend as the sequence of events became clear. Pawlenski took responsibility for publishing Benjamin Griveaux's sex videos on his website, but the original recipient of those images was Alexandre de Tadeo. The 29-year-old law student got in touch with Griveaux on social media in the spring of 2018. She claimed it was just to talk politics. But then their relationship turned intimate. At the time, de Tadeo and Pawlenski were not a couple, leaving many wondering how he obtained the videos. Pawlenski's lawyer, Juan Branco, is also a person of interest. Branco has admitted to giving his client legal advice before the video's publication. The Paris Bar Association has opened an inquiry into whether his legal representation of Pawlenski presents a conflict of interest.
My work as his lawyer was to assure that he respected the law. The unfounded insinuation that I was implicated in this affair is to me an absolute disgrace, not just because it's an attack on my reputation, but because it's an attack on the right to representation.
The trio regularly socialized together before the scandal hit.
Lawmakers in France have begun debating planned reforms to the country's pension system. The process is expected to last several months, with opposition lawmakers introducing some 41,000 amendments in a bid to delay passing the reform. Now, France witnessed the longest transport strike in decades over the government's plan to streamline pensions. For more on this story, here's France 24's Chris Moore reporting from the National Assembly.
With initial opposition to these pension reforms occurred on the streets, with the longest strikes in decades getting underway at the end of last year, unions leading out public transport workers and others. The battle against these reforms now switches to the French Parliament. Now, the French government says the current system is no longer fit for purpose. It's one with 42 separate pension plans, depending on what sector of the economy you work in. And they say that means there are too many anomalies. Some people retiring relatively early on relatively generous pensions, others working later into life for less money. The sceptics say that this proposed reform will simply create a new section of losers within the French workforce. Teachers, for example, not thought to be doing particularly well out of it. And they say it's an abandonment also of the principle of solidarity, namely those in the workforce paying for those in retirement. It'll shift the focus of the way the system works more towards markets, more towards capitalisation. Now, in theory, Macron shouldn't have too much trouble getting reforms through Parliament. He's got a big majority, but there is a very spirited opposition being led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon's left-wing La France Insoumise movement. They and others have tabled over 40,000 amendments in an attempt to scupper all of this. The French government planning to get the first stage of these reforms through the French Parliament in the next couple of weeks, and it could end up taking them quite a lot longer than that.
Chris Moore reporting there earlier. In other news, the United Kingdom is dealing with the after effects of Storm Dennis. It was the second severe storm to hit Britain in the span of a week, bringing 140 km/h winds and a month's worth of rain over just 2 days. But the danger is not yet over. Severe flood warnings remain in place, as Brian Quinn now reports.
Towns flooded, rescuers seeking out trapped residents. Relief efforts were underway Monday in Wales and Western England after Storm Dennis barreled through the region over the weekend. The tempest dumped more than a month's worth of rain over some parts of Britain in just 48 hours. Over 400 homes were flooded as waters in some areas continued to rise.
We had warning, but normally what happens is it comes up, it gets up to the top of the front doorstep, and then it goes away again. But this just kept coming. And at 4 o'clock this morning, it was just rising and rising and rising.
One woman is believed dead after having been carried away by floodwaters near the town of Tenbury. The UK Coast Guard, meanwhile, used a helicopter Sunday to rescue a man stranded in a mobile home in South Wales. Hundreds of flood warnings remain in place across the UK, with 5 severe flood alerts issued Monday. Forecasters say more evacuations may be necessary as river levels in parts of northern England have not yet reached their peak. Dennis also hit northern France, cutting power to tens of thousands of homes. It struck barely a week after Storm Kira, which also disrupted transport, flooded homes, and left thousands without electricity. Britain's Environment Secretary says climate change is making events like Storm Dennis ever more likely.
Brian Quinn there with that report. Now, Mark Zuckerberg was in Brussels on Monday. He was urging officials not to go too far in punishing platforms for carrying hate speech. But the EU's industry commissioner Thierry Breton had strong words for Facebook's boss after the meeting, saying it must adapt to Europe's standards and not the other way around.
Taking a tough line on hate speech online. European Industry Commissioner Thierry Breton didn't mince words after a meeting with Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg.
Online platforms now have a responsibility, an obvious responsibility towards our fellow citizens, towards all of us. If all the platforms operating on the European continent do not comply with the conditions I have just mentioned, we'll be obligated to intervene, and more strictly.
New EU laws are set to roll in at the end of this year, and they could penalise tech giants that fail to rein in hate speech and disinformation. Facebook's failure to self-regulate was exposed in the 2018 Cambridge Analytica scandal. The data of millions of users manipulated and targeted by political advertisers ahead of the 2016 US presidential election. Earlier this month, Facebook's CEO courted controversy after refusing to follow Twitter's lead by banning all political ads on the platform. But at last week's Munich Security Conference, Zuckerberg backed the idea of stricter regulations while maintaining the right to freedom of expression.
I do think that there should be regulation on harmful content. I think that we need to make sure that the internet can continue to be a place where everyone can share their views openly.
With 1.6 billion daily users, Facebook's reach has made it a breeding ground for fake news and hate speech.
Mike Pompeo was in Angola for the second leg of his African tour on Monday. The U.S. Secretary of State touting American business, this as he aims to promote U.S. investment as an alternative to Chinese loans. His trip to the continent is the first by a cabinet official in 18 months. It also comes at a time when West African governments are worried about the possibility of U.S. troop withdrawals. Earlier, I spoke to William Lawrence, professor at the American University in Washington, on what the United States is hoping to achieve with Pompeo's visit.
Certainly to reverse that impression of the United States as having nothing but disdain for Africa, or more importantly, neglecting Africa. The administration did articulate a policy for Africa during the period where Bolton was National Security Advisor in a famous speech here in Washington. And the general tenor of it was trying to do more with less, more security with less troops, more assistance to Africa with actually less money, and a sort of competition with Russia and China, which we've seen glimpses of during Pompeo's trip, but without necessarily a clear strategy on how to do that. One positive of this trip has been that Pompeo has signed a number of new investment agreements and is sort of making the right noises about assisting democratic developments and conflict resolution and health intervention. And so it's all good in terms of an upside for U.S.-Africa policy.
It's all good, but one of the countries that Mike Pompeo is not visiting is Nigeria. That's Africa's largest economy. Why is that?
Well, certainly it would be a very bad time for him to go to Nigeria, given it's one of the 4 countries that Trump is trying to include in the travel bans. And certainly, if you look at the 3 countries they chose, they are countries that are having very positive forward momentum right now. Senegal, commercially, Angola in terms of the democratic dividend, and Ethiopia on a whole range of issues in the Horn of Africa. And so in that sense, it's trying to attach American efforts to good news stories, and Nigeria doesn't have that type of a good news story to attract American engagement at this time.
Now, the U.S. is trying to position itself as an alternative to China. China right now is struggling to contain the coronavirus. Could, a mix of luck and timing work in the U.S.'s favor?
100%. And there's been a number of U.S. officials and others in Washington talking about how terrible it would be if the coronavirus is spread to Africa via the 1.3 million Chinese workers and others who live in the African continent. And so it's a very good moment for a whole range of reasons, including the difficulties going on in China, in part due to the trade war with the United States. And so there's a lot of economic opportunity right now. However, the Americans could very easily shoot themselves in the foot if there's tweets from Trump or other negative movements during the Pompeo visit. But right now, there's a lot of upside to U.S. engagement. And getting back to your setup, the U.S. is the largest private investor in Africa, and that's growing significantly. China, of course, invests on a public model, and that has caused a fair amount of heartburn lately in terms of high debt loads and other things. And so it's a very good time for the U.S. to make this effort. Again, not enough of an effort, but a good start.
In other news, the World Health Organization says every scenario regarding the coronavirus is still on the table, the head of the body reacting to news of a decline in new cases from China. Now, 300 American cruise ship passengers who were evacuated from Japan are in quarantine in Texas and California, while the 14 people who tested positive on the flight for the coronavirus have been sent to Nebraska.
From one quarantine to another. After nearly 2 weeks in isolation aboard the Diamond Princess cruise liner, planes with U.S. evacuees finally land in the United States. But for many, the decision, which came just a few days before the scheduled disembarkment, dashed hopes of a quick return to normalcy.
We would just like to finish the quarantine on the ship as planned, decompress in a non-quarantine environment in Japan for a few days, then fly back to the U.S. pursuant to our own arrangements. What's wrong with that?
Many evacuees had expressed fears about being exposed to infected passengers. Among the more than 300 Americans flown home, at least 14 who tested positive for COVID-19 and were consequently isolated on board from the other passengers. Upon their return to the United States, they will begin another 14 days of mandatory quarantine. Meanwhile, Australia will also evacuate more than 200 of its citizens from the Diamond Princess. They too will be isolated for an additional 2 weeks.
It's frustrating and it's unfortunate, but it is absolutely necessary to ensure that we put the measures in place that have been so effective in containing the spread of this virus and ensuring that Australians here can go about their lives on a daily basis without any concern about the impact of this virus on their health.
On Sunday, 70 new cases of the novel coronavirus aboard the ship were confirmed, bringing the total to more than 350 and making it the largest cluster of cases outside China.
Okay, there with that report. Now, the coronavirus is also having an economic impact, affecting economies beyond mainland China. Emerald Maxwell has a story.
After days of panicked stockpiling by people in Hong Kong, toilet paper is now a hot commodity. And the city's police are tracking armed robbers who stole hundreds of rolls. It's just one of the knock-on effects as COVID-19 has spread across the world. The IMF warns the virus could damage global growth in 2020.
It is true, China today is a much bigger share of the world economy than during SARS. During SARS, 8%. Today, 19%. So if things go bad for China, this is not good news for the rest of the world. It is going to affect global value chains, already affecting some. It is affecting tourism. It is affecting travel.
Southeast Asia is paying a particularly heavy price for the new coronavirus. tourism has plummeted as Chinese travellers find themselves subject to a host of restrictions both at home and abroad. Stigma around the disease has also put travellers off, damaging a sector that accounts for a fifth of the country's GDP. Close to 1 million tourists are usually expected from China every month, but that's fallen by 86% so far this year. Losses linked to the virus are set to reach over 7 billion euros in Thailand. Vietnam and Cambodia have also seen tourism takings shrink. Meanwhile, Japan and Singapore appear to be on the brink of recession as the epidemic disrupts supply chains around the world.
EU foreign ministers agreed to launch a new maritime effort in the Mediterranean Sea aimed at enforcing a UN arms embargo in Libya. The mission will be replacing Operation Sophia, set up in 2015 to crack down on migrant smuggling. Austria lifted its objections to the new mission, saying it will remain vigilant for any signs migrants were being attracted to Europe. Monty Francis reports.
Seeing no other way to effectively stop the flow of arms into war-torn Libya, EU foreign ministers agreed to a new naval mission in the Mediterranean Sea, replacing Operation Sophia, which was launched in 2015.
Sophia was covering the whole Libyan coast, from one side to the other, from one border to the other of the country. If we want to control the arms embargo, we have to concentrate our surveillance on the east part, where the arms is coming from.
Operation Sophia was effectively suspended last year amid disputes between EU countries over where Libyan migrants picked up at sea should end up. In addition to concentrating on the eastern Mediterranean, EU officials said the new mission will include ships as well as air resources and the possibility of ground forces. The plan faced opposition from Austria and Hungary, whose governments have taken a tough anti-immigration stance. Details are still being finalized, including a possible provision to halt the operation if ships start to attract migrants.
We will now work on the details of a new mission, in which the monitoring of the arms embargo will be a focal point.
Making the arms embargo work is seen as crucial to stabilizing the Libyan conflict, where the Tripoli government, backed by the UN, is under attack from the forces of military strongman Khalifa Haftar, who controls much of the country's south and east.
In other news, Moussa Marega walked off the pitch during a game in Portugal's Primeira Liga after saying he was subjected to racist slurs. The Malian international player says it was no longer possible to continue playing when fans from the opposing side were mocking the color of his skin. The 28-year-old even taken to social media to go after the match's referees over their failure to protect him, calling them a disgrace.
Dramatic scenes in Portugal's Primeira Liga. Porto forward Moussa Marega walked off the field during a game against Vitória de Guimarães, saying he was subjected to racist abuse from opposition fans. After scoring in the 60th minute, the Mali international pointed to his skin in response to a section of supporters who were allegedly making monkey noises during the game. Seats were then thrown at Marega from the stands. The 28-year-old, who spent a season on loan at Vitória, was booked after picking one up in defiance during his celebration. Several of Marega's teammates tried to stop him leaving the field minutes after putting his side ahead. He was eventually substituted before showing his middle fingers to the crowd. Vitória says it is investigating the incident. In a post on Instagram, Marega had strong words for the accused fans and match officials.
I hope I never see you on a football field again. You're a disgrace. And I also thank the referees for not defending me and for giving me a yellow card because I defend my skin color.
Porto's manager Sergio Conceição slammed the abuse after the final whistle, saying Marega had been targeted by racist chants since the team warm-up. Goalkeeper Iker Casillas tweeted his support, while Porto's condemnation of fans' behaviour was echoed by the Portuguese league's governing body in a statement and several other clubs on social media. Sunday's incident was also condemned by Portugal's president and prime minister. Such scenes are unprecedented in Portuguese football, but have become increasingly common on pitches across Europe, raising questions on whether football is doing enough to tackle racism.